Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. My name is BWASA Khumalo, and I'm the chair of the Business Women's Association of South Africa. Welcome to everyone to the BWA Census Report 2021 presentation. We are most delighted as the BWA to host this event. Now the Census Report seeks to track the upward mobility of women in corporate and public sector. The continuous discrimination of women in the workplace is still a sad reality in this day and age. And the issues of inclusion and diversity have to be a priority if we have to move forward as a country. And the 2021 edition of our Women in Leadership Census comes at a very critical time when we, alongside the rest of the world, grapple with the question of how humanity collectively we can move forward post-COVID-19. And we certainly need an inclusive growth, an inclusive economic growth in terms of where women should be at the forefront. Now, this morning, we're really honored to have an esteemed panel of thought leaders, leaders who are moving the needle, who are shaping our economy, and who are taking the agenda of women empowerment forward. We have the esteemed Minister Pravin Gordhan. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us this morning. We have Ndate Bonang Mohale of Business Unity South Africa. We have Yolanda Tuba, the Regional Vice President, MTN, and founder of the Mentorship Boardroom, as well as Arti Takude from the CFO of Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Welcome, everyone. I'm now going to hand over to our President, Ms. Gunya Lala Mapisa, to take us through the presentation. Over to you, Gunya.
Thank you so much, Basi, and good morning to everybody. Honorable Minister, thank you so very much for honoring us with your presence this morning. And I just want to say welcome. And what I'm going to do this morning is just take us through the presentation in terms of the results of the census. So what the BWA census seeks to do, as Basi was saying, is it's a real head count. It's a census research report that looks at women in leadership positions in the various part of the economy. So just maybe a little bit about the Business Women's Association by way of introduction. This is one of the oldest association of its kind. We are more than 41 years old this year as an association, and we have been engaged in the Women in Leadership Census since 2004. And this is essentially an advocacy tool that seeks to, because what we always say that, you know, we have to speak from a position of actual data when we talk about the fact that there are no women in leadership positions in various spaces. And so the scope of the research basically looks at all companies that are listed on the JSE. And we go through a process of actually engaging with every single one of them individually, so that we look at the number of women that sit on the board, the number of women that are on the executive, the chairpersons, the CEO. And so it's a real head count of all those companies. And then we also, of course, look at women leadership in state-owned enterprises. And Minister, again, thank you so much for availing your time this morning to have a conversation around the mobility of women, particularly in that space. And we've also compared this with data from the public service. Because when we are talking about women in the workplace, we have to look right across the board, and it's not just an issue of listed companies and SOEs, but it's also comparatively, how does the public service actually compare to the rest of the workplace. For the past 2-3 reports, we have also included women in higher education. So we look at all the universities, the public universities around the country, and we've included 26 of the top universities. And of course, we also have since expanded to also look at the multinationals, because there are some multinationals that are not listed on the JSE. So we then have to look at them individually. And the way the report is represented, it's represented in various ways in terms of sector, in terms of racial representation, because we also see that there's a difference in terms of in terms of how women occupy those spaces, whether in the case of executive women, for example, in listed companies, you find more white women than black women. Is that something that we look at, or is that a conversation that we have? So those are the kind of results that we have, and just to also say that the report is available on the BWA website, and we can go and look at the report in detail. But I'm just going to go through the few highlights in terms of what we have found. I mean, when you look at the workplace in general, women make up 50.7% of the total population, but only 45% of employed workforce. And then of that, only 17% of the CEOs and chairperson positions combined are actually filled by women. And when you go through the census and look at the specific results, you'll find that those become consistent in terms of women in leadership. And then I think that, as we're doing the report, the one thing that we're able to pick up was those companies that are really doing fantastic in terms of ensuring that women are represented. And in particular, we found 2 companies that have got more than 70% of women represented on their board, and that's Adcock Ingram Holdings and the JSC. And Arti, thank you so much for joining us. And maybe you can share a little bit of how you guys got it so right, because we do think that that those kind of numbers are representative of what is possible. And then also just another recognition in terms of the University of Cape Town, which has most of their leadership positions being women. I mean, the chancellor is a black woman, the vice chancellor is a black woman, the chair of council is a woman, and out of the 11 council committees, 9 of those are also headed by women. And I also have the honor of sitting in the UCT Council myself. So I find that it's quite encouraging to find that there are spaces that allow that to happen. And then just in general, in terms of the key findings of JSC listed companies specifically, again, there's been really marginal increase when you look at the report over a number of years. I think what we have here is a slide that just shows since the inception of the census report in 2004 to date. If you look at the numbers, I mean, when we first started, CEOs made up about 4.9%. 2011 it was 9.7%, and then we are now sitting at 17.3%. It's an increase. It's still below what we expect, but certainly looking at where we are coming from, I think that it's a number that begins to show that there's some movement. But of course, as you move down the bottom of the pyramid, you also see that the numbers start to even out. So you have the same situation where you have 45% of women in the workplace, but in terms of where they are positioned at the top, the numbers become very minimal. And then some of the key findings, again, in the same vein of recognizing some of the companies that show us that it is actually possible. We have some of the companies that have got 50% or more. I spoke of the 2 that have got 70% earlier, but there are some in our findings that have got 50% or more women who are on their boards, and this includes, again, Adcock. I think I spoke about it earlier. Alex Co, Barloworld, in the IDC, the JSC, the Land and Cultural Bank, Sasol Limited. So there is quite a number of companies that that are able to show that it is actually possible, and there are women out there that have got the capacity and the capability to be in leadership. But of course, you also have those that are still lagging behind at below 25%. And it's quite a number of companies, unfortunately, and it's quite concerning for us as an association, because oftentimes we are told that there are no women that have got the capacity, or there are no women that are ready to sit on those positions. But what we find is that that's actually not necessarily a fact. There are women that have capacity to be able to sit in those positions, but So a few of those companies that are below 25%, you've got Astra Foods Limited, you've got Blue Label Telecoms, you've got Cash Build, Investec Limited, Growth Point Properties, and Discovery Limited. So those are companies that we know of. Those are companies that that are leaders in our economy. And I think that Mohale, I would imagine that those are some of your members at BWASA, or rather at BLSA via BWASA. And so some of the engagements that we have this morning, perhaps you can try and help us understand a bit more what the situation is there. And then I think that again, this is a graph that just shows that the numbers, again, consistently, you have quite a number of companies that that are still below the required numbers, and I think that there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. And then again, so a lot of these graphs that we are putting forward, there are graphs that you will find in the report, and you'll be able to read more and go into more detail. I'm just going to rush through this because I'm mindful of the fact that we don't really have a lot of time. But I think that if you go to the BWA website, you'll be able to download the report, and you'll also be able to download an executive summary that will show you what the results look like, and you are able to read that in more detail. And again, this is just a pie chart representing the split in terms of racial terms, in terms of how women are positioned between executive positions and non-executive positions. And again, you see that you have a situation where there's also a difference when you're looking at white women versus black women. Is that a conversation? Is that not a conversation? But I think from a BWA perspective, what we always really focus on is the fact that women collectively, before you even go into the issues of percentages between black and white women, women collectively, as we stand together, what are the numbers looking like, and what is it that needs to be done, particularly by policymakers. And then we also had a look at professional services firms and multinationals, as I mentioned a bit earlier. Professional services firms, you basically have your big accounting firms, your big law firms, and these are the leading firms in the country. And we find that in terms of women representation in professional services space, women are represented a bit more in leadership positions. And again, is it an issue of the nature of the work? Is it an issue of the ability for women to be able to accommodate their home life and their work life? Is that even an issue? What is it that professional services firms are doing that other companies are not able to do? So those are the numbers as you see them there. And then women in government. I mean, government has always taken a lead, and I think, Minister, that's also something that perhaps you can give us a little bit of insight in terms of how the government has gotten correct in terms of just ensuring that women are represented really consistently across all leadership positions. And when you look at the public service, even though the numbers are still not great, I mean, the BWA, alongside all our other social partners in this conversation, including the IWFSA, what we are saying is that we are calling for 50-50 representation of women in leadership. And so even though the public service numbers are looking slightly better, there's still a bit more that can be done in terms of reaching the 50-50 gender parity that we speak of. And then again, the women in higher education institutions, we looked at 26 universities, as I was saying at the beginning, and universities again are also performing slightly better, and they show consistently across the board at a 60-40 split. you know, in terms of the split between representation of men and women in leadership. So that's essentially just a synopsis of our results and what we have. And I encourage you to all just visit our website and look at this report in detail. And for us, this is a key report 15 years later, or 15 reports later. The numbers are not changing. And I think we have gotten to a point where we are now saying, you know, collectively you know, collectively, what is it that needs to be happening? So I'll hand over to our moderator, Ms. Tamingubeni, so that you can just engage with our panelists, and then we can see what it is that we need to be doing about these numbers. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mapisa, and a very good morning to all of you, wherever it is that you may be and whatever platform that you may be joining us on. I'm Tamingubeni, and I'll be moderating the conversations that we'll be having this morning with our various special guests as well as our panelists. And welcome to the media as well from the different media houses who have responded and are with us. Just a note that as we go along, if you've got any questions that you'd like to pose to any of our panelists, please do feel free to pose those questions as we go. So you can pose those in the chat room, and we'll be facilitating those Q&As at the end of our session. But you don't have to wait until the end to pose those questions. You can pretty much ask as we go. First of all, a very good morning as well to our Honourable Minister, Pravin Gordhan, Minister of Public Enterprises. Good to have you with us this morning. And a very good morning to you as well, Mr. Bonang Mohale, who is a chairperson of Business Unity South Africa. We'll be starting off our conversation as we dissect the statistics and the results of the Women in Leadership Census for Business Women's Association of South Africa. And we'll start off with you, Minister Pravin Gordhan. You would have heard Ms. Mapisa congratulating, I guess, government and congratulating state-owned enterprises for really making it to the top of the list. But if you look at it, it is literally below 50%. None of the various sectors that have been surveyed have even reached the halfway mark of 50%. We have got, let me go through this for a moment, we have got the national government departments at 43.5%. We have got state-owned enterprises at 40.4%. Really the best of the worst in this particular case. But for you, Minister Gordhan, how do you view these numbers, and what are they an indicator of? How would you evaluate your strides and your efforts, not only in state-owned enterprises, but in government as well, because you've been a key figure in government, having held a large number of positions in leadership over the decades. Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Tammy. And once again, good morning to my colleagues on the panel and my fellow male, Bonang. He was feeling lonely until I came on. And greetings to all of those that have joined you. Firstly, let me congratulate you on undertaking this survey so consistently and being able to demonstrate to South Africans, particularly in business, but also in government, about the kind of progress that we're making, but also the gaps that we have to attend to as a society. When you make reference to government, I think we need to take our minds back to 1994 and subsequent years as well, when the governing party made a decision that, for example, in Parliament, there should be a 50-50 representation between men and women. Secondly, in cabinet, the same proportions apply as well. And there's been a great deal of diligence in terms of making sure that that is complied with, even now at a local government level, as we go into the local government elections on the 1st of November. So that's been a consistent policy position, and one that is now extending, as you've pointed out through your surveys, into SOEs, into universities, and other government departments as well. So whilst I agree that there's a gap between the 40s and the 50s, compared to the private sector. Bonang, hope you don't mind. Government has made huge strides in this particular regard. And certainly the philosophy that underpins it is in some ways captured by a quote I was given by Thomas Sankara, that to liberate any nation's productive forces, the centrality of women in leadership is absolutely key. And he argues, and I quote, "There is no true social revolution without the liberation of women." And this has been a consistent policy position of the governing party and of government as we go forward. Let me also remind you that for us, this is a year of Charlotte Makeke, and here again is a symbol or a symbolic person in our history who demonstrated what it means in practical terms to become a professional, to become an activist, and to act as a role model for many generations subsequently as well. So on the side of SOEs and so on, I mean, I don't manage, or our department doesn't take responsibility for all of them, but the common government position would apply there as well. And so we would certainly agree with you that the concept of inclusivity is not only one with reference to those who are left behind and those who have and have not, but applies to many other categories in society, women in particular. And so inclusivity, and I'm glad that that's become part of your vocabulary, has to be given its full meaning, both in the sense of gender equality, but also the major challenges that we face as a society. The massive inequality that we have, and now that the corporate sector might be required in terms of law to report the gap between the highest earning and lowest earning and the medium earnings, I think South Africa is again moving in the right direction to make sure that the discrimination against women in particular, but Black women as well in specifically, is something that we eliminate over time. Equally, I think we all need to be mindful that patriarchy is a major issue in South Africa, as it is in many other parts of the world. And our president has been focusing a lot in this particular area so that we begin to change as a society, as we also fight poverty, ensure that there's diversity, and importantly, that all of us do some out-of-the-box thinking, if you like, as we go forward. So in sum, how did we get here? Well, it's been through first a set of policy choices, secondly, ensuring that those choices are actually implemented, and thirdly, continue to nurture the development of each sector of our society, in particular women, to have their rightful place, both in the economy and in the various institutions that we actually have.
Minister, I'd like you to take you back to the 50% target that was set. We're currently sitting at 43.5% in government. Why is government still failing to reach this goal almost 10 years since the cabinet resolution was taken? What are the challenges that you still face?
Well, I think, well, I can't generalize, so forgive me for that. I don't represent all of government here, but certainly the challenges would be in some instances, a lack of mindfulness towards that particular balance that we're trying to achieve. Secondly, if you take the SOEs, we had in yesteryear women in very prominent positions. And with the advent of state capture, good people left SOEs, professionals, and I'm sure you all know one or more people who were in SOEs who said, I don't want to be part of this. And I will not either support state capture or keep quiet about it. And today, regrettably, I think we need to acknowledge that many professionals, in particular women in this case, don't want to be identified with being employed in an SOE environment. Yet others, of course, and we have examples of that, are ready to cross the line and make their contribution in terms of the national interest as well. So I would regard it as work in progress as we go forward. But there are various social factors and perhaps skills factors as well. And the rate at which we develop those skills in South Africa is something that I think all of us need to give more attention to, so that we prepare all sections of our society to participate at the levels that you are actually talking about as well. One major change that we have made in recent years is to include a few young people, young professionals, in boards of SOEs, and to give them experience as to what corporate governance means, what it means to be a participant in a board, and so on. And many of them have acquitted themselves well. And if we continue with that, I think we then have a, if you like, pipeline of talent nationally that is working in small SOEs and then working their way up to the bigger SOEs, where we have a fair representation of women as well.
And I'd like to bring you in here, Mr. Mohale. How do you view the fact that government as well as SOEs are surpassing private business? Private companies are sitting at 36.7% representativity, multinationals at 38%. Should the leadership of women in business be surpassing that of women in government and SOEs? Should that be the expectation, and is it?
So, Sis Tammy, you are absolutely correct. In fact, the private sector must be taking the lead on this one, especially because the private sector pre-COVID was employing 16.5 million people when the whole of government was employing 2.3 million people. Now in the COVID, we are talking about 1.3 million people that are employed by the public sector, so the three tiers of government. And in the private sector, that number is still around 16 million, even though we have lost net about 1 million jobs. So when one considers that each of those probably looks after a minimum of 5 other people, so you can see the catastrophe we're in. And it needs to be fronted and driven by the private sector. I should have started by apologizing that we had a massive storm in the Bryanston area the whole of last night and into the early hours of this morning. So I can see that I have no Wi-Fi, so I'm oscillating between 4G and 3G. If I'm incoherent, it's not because I drank too much last night. But I think charity, like clarity, Metami, begins at home. So let me start about the small entity that we are responsible for in the 2 boards that I chair, SBV Services, but also the Bidvest Group Limited. And I'll talk about just one in the interest of time. So in 32 years of SBV, it's in the top 10 of the companies listed on the JSE. For the first time, it has a woman leading it, Usis Nompumelelo Tembegile Madisa. And in just 1 year of her leadership, 80% of that board is black and 70% is women. And women are, for the first time, managing even one of the 6 divisions, which is financial services. In fact, we have just appointed 2 more women to be CEOs of the more than 350 companies, 240 of which are operating entities. And in total, 135,000 employees. But for me, the significance of why we want to bring women in large numbers in positions of leadership is because the data is very clear and explicit. Those companies that are led by women, not only are they more profitable, more sustainable in the short term, and to build on long-term resilience, but they actually command more PE multiples upon exit. In fact, they are the best companies to work for. They are the ones that have a higher level of employee engagement. And generally, when you ask the employees who work there, they are more happy and indeed joyful. We have just concluded a deal where we sold a significant stake of Coin Security, again in CIT, led by African women chartered accountants, Cindy C. Wentombenhle Mabasokoyan. And again, we went out of our way looking for them. We persuaded them to be part of this. That deal was done, vendor financed by the company. And I think the more we do that, I think the better. Says Tammy, the last one from my end is when you look at those entities that have absolutely been blessed to lead from 1996, the world's biggest and oldest elevator company, Otis, right up to the last one, which is Shell Oil Products Africa, with a presence in 33 out of the 55 African countries. I've always been blessed to leave mostly women, and if not, at least Africans. So at Shell, as we speak now, the chairman is Ubabuhloni Pizwe Justice Mdolo. At Business Leadership South Africa, 89 CEOs, we left Mebusi Mavuso. And indeed, even at Otis Elevators, the 6 MDs that succeeded me ever since I left, all of them have been absolutely African. The data that you are sharing today is consistent with what Meta Biakabinde, in her capacity as the chairperson of the Employment Equity Commission, releases. So on the 22nd anniversary of this report, we demonstrate beyond any shadow of doubt that women representation in positions of leadership, C-suite I'm talking about, is less than 24%. African women in particular, less than 4%. And yet we know that when you put a smartphone in the hands of women, not only does the nutrition, the health, and education of their own children improve, but that of the society and the community from which they come. Ngiyabonga kakhulu Sisi Thami.
Bonge thina Ntate Mohale, really accolades being brought to the work that has been done and the progress that has been made. But Minister, I bring this next question back to you. Despite the gains that Ntate Mohale is highlighting now, the numbers still do reflect that SOEs performed better than private organizations and corporates. But these are, suppliers of government. These are suppliers and service providers of SOEs. The preferential procurement policies are in place to ensure that diversity is there, that representation in the private sector is there. But where do you believe the gaps are? How can SOEs further facilitate representation in multinationals as well as other service providers? And I include how government as well can do that.
No, it's a very good question, and one which perhaps requires us to also shift some paradigms around as well. Because we're still talking about, in a sense, and you'll forgive me for this, enforcing people to do things, as opposed to undertaking a complete mindset change in society more generally. And secondly, understanding that making a profit in the private sector is not unnecessarily unrelated to the composition of boards or management or staff. In fact, they're directly related, and I think Bonang has been pointing that out. And the third point is that on the one hand, we have demonstrated, if you like, political will to make sure that we get as close as possible, if not achieve 50-50, as I said earlier on, parliament, cabinet, etc., etc. Now, where is there a similar corporate will is the question that I think we need to ask ourselves, so that it's not by regulation that you achieve this, but because there's a fundamental shift in leadership mindsets in the corporate sector, be it men or women, by the way, because sometimes both require a mindset shift, if you don't mind me saying so, and that as a society we become progressive in that regard, and providing ourselves with leaders in business who understand that the bottom line does matter. We've now moved from there to ESG reporting. We moved from shareholder interest to stakeholder interests. But now I think we need to go beyond stakeholder interests or redefine it so that women become important stakeholders in the process as well. So coming back to the preferential procurement paradigm or legislation, that has been progressing. But perhaps if we look at the micro information, which I haven't looked at recently, much more could be done in that particular regard. But in some, I'm arguing that you need societal changes. You need a change in culture. You need a change in mindsets. You need a change in paradigms on the one hand, and then where necessary, legislation and regulation should play a role as well. So the question is that your association has played a formidable role in undertaking these surveys, putting facts before us, because all of us are now saying, let's base our decision making on data, not just impressions of data. We have the data in front of us. The next question is, how do we build an alliance with yourselves, both in government and outside of government, to ensure that these facts inform the kind of changes that actually need to be made, and that the word inclusive, on the one hand, and the kind of mindsets that women bring to any collective in terms of their insights, in terms of bringing in greater empathy where that is appropriate, added to issues like solidarity, social justice, and what national interest means apart from business interest. I think all of that mix in the next couple of years could place South Africa again in the forefront of social change. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ndade Bonang, as a champion of transformation in organizations that you're involved in organizations that you lead, I'm going to pose this question that I posed to the Minister to you as well. And if you could speak to us from the corporate's perspective, where are the gaps? How can SOEs, how can government better perhaps incentivize business in order to be transformational, considering the fact that they are still ahead of you as far as transformation is concerned? The Minister spoke about not wanting to over-legislate, but that there needs to be a cultural shift and a cultural change and an innate desire for that transformation. But from your vantage point, where are the gaps? How can this transformation and gender equity be further facilitated by government and state-owned enterprises?
So the first gap is that there's intellectual agreement that women empowerment, women advancement, women's occupation of positions of leadership makes good business sense. But the practice on the ground is not there, because these men are saying it's okay that it happens everywhere else, but not in the company where I'm still the CEO. Therefore, they are not actively planning, agitating, and orchestrating that succession. Not only is it seamless, but it's purposeful, it's deliberate, it's conscious, where you as the CEO, you go out of your way to look for the best woman there is out there, rather than opening it up to men where up until today, 74% of the positions of leadership, again, C-suite, is still occupied by white male, mostly Afrikaners. That's where the first gap is. The second gap is really not a full appreciation that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and the analogy is diversity for me is actually being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance, but belonging is being allowed to bring and play your own music. Can we create an environment in which these women come in, they are not pretending to be men, wearing suits and trousers, bringing their femininity, their ability to connect, their intuition, their ability just to be good, quality human beings, because they are managing our households and our children. And the least of our problems is, would they be able to manage our companies? At institutions of higher learning, I'm the Chancellor of the University of the Free State. The last graduation that I oversaw, 75% of the graduates were women, including in PhDs and in masters. So when we left the 89 CEOs at Business Leadership South Africa, their strategy was geared towards exactly what you're talking about, because it rested on three pillars. The first, of course, at that time, we're in the midst of state capture. We said we need to root out and defeat state capture. Honorable Minister Gordon is saying, you know, one of the four pillars of state capture is getting rid of the good people and replacing them with bad people. That's where most of these SOEs and SOCs, in fact, more than 740 of them, have actually been hollowed out deliberately and purposefully. The second strategy was, we spoke about this inclusive socio-economic growth and transformation. It sounds tautologous, but we wanted to be absolutely explicit. When we said include, we said, who are we going to include? We meant the 51% of the population that is women and Black people in general. Lastly, we spoke about the protection of key state institutions because those were the ones that were absolutely under attack. It's very sad that, especially in the private sector, less so in the more than 740 state-owned enterprises, by the way, and the Ministry of Public Enterprises, in its peak, was responsible for only 8. The Ministry of Communications, 13. So there's more SOEs and SOCs outside of public enterprises than those that are actually inside. That as we speak today, all of us collectively have not succeeded in eradicating the legacy of apartheid, where the triple oppression and that burden is on the shoulders more of women than on even African men. So for me, as I conclude, Metami, to be able to move forward, I think we need to talk to men to say they are the ones who are the gatekeepers. It's men that are supposed to bring down the proverbial glass, now concrete ceiling. It's the men that continue to see more merit in more people that come from the same institution as them, that smoke the same brand of cigarette as they do. They are the ones that are continuing to train, develop, counsel, coach men to sponsor other men when what the country and indeed the world needs is women. In fact, as I conclude, Sister, I think that the virus and the pandemic has demonstrated beyond any shadow of doubt that the 8 countries where women are heads of state, they dealt better with this pandemic than those where men are heads of state, and I include New Zealand, Germany, and all the Scandinavian countries. Metami?
Thank you very much, Ndati Mohale, for that. And we'll touch on some of the aspects and some of the points that you made a little bit later on this morning when we open up our panel discussion. Minister, I'd like to bring this back to you. In the South African Airways deal, Takatso Consortium now will be owning, well, is owning 51% of South African Airways. What is the leadership and the ownership component of women in that particular consortium? And was this a concerted deliberation on your part as Minister of Public Enterprises or as the Ministry of Public Enterprises to ensure that there is women representation in that landmark deal?
Well, I'm glad you're calling it a landmark deal for a start. So that's a good message out there to the public. But let's remind ourselves that SAA was also pretty much part of what my colleague Bonang has described, i.e. state capture, mismanagement, corruption, etc. Secondly, that in December 2019, SAA was placed in business rescue. Thirdly, in March 2020, we are impacted as a country, and of course the world is as well, by the COVID pandemic. And then the fourth is that while it is in business rescue, it's only in July 2020 that the final business rescue plan actually emerged. It is around that time that any number of entities, there were about 30 in all at the beginning, who expressed an interest in becoming part of SAA or owning a part of SAA. But the longer the COVID pandemic lasted, as you know, the aviation industry has lost globally probably close to $100 billion in this short period of time. Aviation took a serious knock, and many of them, well, before that, we appointed a transaction advisor, and many of them that showed an initial interest actually fell by the wayside. So this was a purely, if you like, commercial deal where we didn't go and look for people, but we asked the transaction advisor to establish who were the serious expressors of interest. And we end up with the current potential partner, because there's still a lot of technical and legal work to do, We've almost completed the due diligence exercise. The sale and purchase agreement is now being negotiated. So, and then, as you know, thereafter, there's a whole lot of regulatory processes that we need to go through as well. So in that sense, this is not about excluding or including women. We were presented with a really disastrous situation as far as aviation is concerned. And this deal helps us to at least keep SAA alive, but on a completely different basis from the way it existed before. And then it's up to the new majority owners of SAA. And of course, government will certainly, as we move into the new era, ensure that business that emerges from this new entity and its new majority owners is also directed at women-owned businesses and so on. So that chapter will follow once we finish all the legal intricacies that we have to at the moment.
So you are confirming that it wasn't one of your key considerations when this deal was being negotiated?
We didn't have anything in front of us that would make that possible.
Nade Mohale, what are your thoughts on this? Should this have been on the table?
I think he's frozen.
Nade Mohale, can you hear?
I can empathize with. Yes, I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now. Could you take that answer from the top, please? We lost you there as you were starting to answer your question.
I was saying I'm absolutely aligned with Honorable Minister Pravin Gordhan. It sounds wonderful to say honorable in front of a minister again. It should have been part of the consideration, because you see, these things are not either or. They are both and together at the same time, simultaneously, concurrently, and in parallel. Women empowerment, gender equality, pay parity are two sides of the same coin. We can't look at economic growth without first and foremost addressing that key part. Let me make an example. We have the African Bank as the only black bank that was built by Dr. Sam Motsuenyane and the oldest black organization in this country, NAFCOC. The membership of NAFCOC, at that time when it was formed, in their inaugural conference at Sun City, was 64% women. Even with the 2 weeks in July of looting, in any mall of the 200 malls that were destroyed and burned, 90% are small and medium enterprises. 75% of these SMEs are actually companies owned by women. So now we rescue African Bank as government. The South African Reserve Bank goes out on a public process to say we want to dispose of our 50%. Looking at the Prudential Authority, they are saying if we sell 15% now, shareholder, that conversation does not even involve women, where the majority, when this bank was formed, took them 10 years to raise 1 million. By the time the bank came into operation, it was 50, stolen by the apartheid government by increasing the capital adequacy requirement. That 15% that they want to sell represents 750 million rand. I don't know many women who are walking around with 30 million rand. I think the best thing we could have done, if we take issues of gender parity and gender empowerment seriously, is the South African Reserve Bank to say our 50% stake in business, we are going to sell it back to women at the very least. If you wanted to be politically correct, you then have said maybe to black people in general, because then the majority of whom are actually women. And it will be vendor financed by the South African Reserve Bank itself, because that's what we do in the private sector. In fact, as the Prudential Authority, when you say to the 4 major banks, and if you include Capitec with now 17 million customers as one of the top 5, we will do half of it. Could you finance the other half? I can tell you that the First Rand Group Limited would have jumped at the opportunity. ABSA would have jumped at the opportunity. So it's about us men who are still in charge of the temporary occupants of the corridors of power to think creatively about how we bring women in, because if we succeed, I can tell you that these banks and businesses in general, I think not only will they be more resilient, like I said, they'll be much more profitable system.
Thank you for that answer, and Dade Mohale. Just a couple of housekeeping. If you are watching on Facebook, or you're watching on YouTube, or you're watching on Zoom, please do send through your questions that you have as we go. You're all invited, and we will have a question and answer session at the end of our time together this morning and give you an opportunity to have the questions that you have specifically to our various panel members answered. And Minister Gordhan, I think, let me go back to the comment that I made earlier on about a landmark ruling, not to pass any judgment on that particular deal. A landmark really was to say it could be a game changer, certainly a turning point. Where it goes from here remains to be seen. So it could be a turning point for the yay or a turning point for the nay. So I reserve my judgment as far as that is concerned. I would like to, though, at this point, bring in our other panelists that are with us today. We've got Ms. Yolanda Kuba, who is the Vice President for Southern and Eastern Africa for the MTN Group, and she's also founder of the Mentorship Boardroom. And also we've got Ms. Arti Takudin, who is the CFO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Ladies, you've been with us right from the start, and I'm sure listening quite ardently to the first part of this conversation, which was really centered around a government, national government, as well as state-owned enterprises. But as you can see now, very closely edging into the symbiotic relationship that exists between the private sector, as well as government, and as well as state-owned enterprises. Ms. Kuba, if I could ask you the very same question that I asked Minister Pravin Gordhan, was this a missed opportunity for government to immediately include women in a deal that is currently being negotiated for SAA? I think your mic is muted. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry about that. Hi, Tammy, and thanks for the question. I think, there's a principle here that we need to actually think about this and apply our minds to before we actually come into the issues of representation and everything else. And the issue is that there is no society that takes itself seriously and celebrates itself that systematically and consistently exclude the other half of the population. And that is a fundamental point. And so whenever there are transactions or whenever there are positions being filled, and you read week after week, day after day, that they are filled only by men, right? It is actually disheartening and actually makes even the women believe that they will never get there. And so for me, looking at this and saying, okay, for example, in the UK, the Gender Pay Gap Act has been in place since 1970, before I was even born, right? And yet today, you're still actually talking about gender pay gap where there was a law, right? So this is not a law thing. It is actually it's people making conscious decisions to actually exclude. So for me, then when I look at the whole picture, I'm saying to myself, what is wrong with this picture? What is wrong that we're still sitting here so many years later and still actually having this debate on whether women should be represented at 50-50 in all spheres of life? And the reality is that I think the reason we're not making progress, we're only looking, for example, sometimes at representation. And representation is only but one element. There are two other elements that I think are equally important, and the minister actually touched on one of them, and that is social justice and economic equality. If I look at the key drivers of why people are getting ahead, it's economic equality. Those who have money continue to actually do better. And if we are not actually empowering women from an economic perspective, let's not be surprised that the people that are at the helm actually stay absolutely the same. So from that perspective, I would say absolute missed opportunity from my side, just to drive the message that we are still committed. I still, however, do commend government for actually being at the forefront in terms of transformation, in terms of representation in South Africa. However, we still have a long way to go.
Ms. Takrudeen, your views regarding this? Is it a missed opportunity, and is it too late for government to actually include women very consciously in deals such as this? I used the word landmark a little bit earlier on because this could, in some way, and the minister will confirm that or not in just a moment. This could end up being a blueprint, perhaps, for the solutions that are being experienced in state-owned enterprises at the moment. So how this particular deal is structured and how it is approached could very much end up being a template moving forward. So your thoughts, Ms. Takrudeen, is this a missed opportunity?
Thanks, Tami, and good morning to everyone on the panel. Yeah, I think your word landmark is spot on, to be honest, because all it did was created some positive momentum in the way forward at a South Africa Inc. level. So I'm quite grateful for that. It could be a precedent setting. I think that we will not do badly as a society if we incorporated participation thinking, threshold participation thinking in whatever transaction we do, in whatever environment we are in, whether that is in the public or the private sector. So I do feel like the structural change, unfortunately, as the minister had mentioned, was a mindset change. Bonang mentioned that the existing men in the system need to change the way that they behave and make decisions. Yolanda said it's a conscious decision. So I'm hugely in agreement with them in that it is a matter of leadership and decision-making at a leadership level.
Minister Gordhan, when we look at state-owned enterprises, the issues that they're facing, issues of trying to get them to not be reliant on the fiscus, whether those contributions from government are bailouts or they are in a form of recapitalization. You've mentioned earlier on the damage that state capture has done to state-owned enterprises. You've mentioned the issue of corruption. With all of these in mind, do you believe or do you think that putting women at the center and the development of women at the center has been put somewhat on the back burner because there seem to be, quote unquote, more burning, more pressing issues that need to be attended in the immediate?
No, I don't think that's the correct approach, Tami, with respect. I mean, you have a woman who's heading a big institution like Transnet at a CEO level. You have the CFO of Transnet, who's also a woman. The chief legal officer was also a woman. So here's a practical example where once we get the opportunity to settle a particular entity, we then look at the inclusivity factor as we have been discussing this morning. And that's a clear demonstration of the kind of direction that we would want to go in as we go ahead to other SOEs as well. But secondly, I don't think that from the outside, if I may say so with the greatest of respect, we can really understand the kind of, Bonang called it hollowing out, which is absolutely correct, damage that has been done in these institutions. And to put them back on the right footing is a massive task. And certainly one of the tasks, as the president has said several times, when he addressed the question of SOEs, is how do we get the reliance on the fiscus off our books so that these institutions are well run, they are at least in a position where their expenses are met by their revenue, and that they also have some spare cash to invest in infrastructure and other necessities that the country requires. Now, it's in this particular sense that perhaps by early next year, you'll get more information in the public domain about work that has been going on in the SOE Council on reconfiguring the SOEs in a manner in which some of the past tragedies, if you like, can be left behind. But all of this takes place in the context of the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. which has the backing of both business and labor, and of course, government itself. And even the question of gender, I think, and the position of women and women-owned businesses need to be an important component, and is an important component. If you look at support for small businesses and medium-sized businesses, the agriculture sector, and other sectors of the economy, as part of the rebuilding process, there needs to be that element of inclusivity. And my colleagues that are responsible for different departments are certainly making sure that they pursue what is a key policy position in government. And of course, if Bonang doesn't mind, the key missing factor, government only constitutes about 30% of our GDP. 70% is in the private sector. So I think revolution in the private sector, in the positive sense, is what is required in order to make the biggest shifts that we actually need. But nonetheless, I think, as you've correctly pointed out, government is leading this process in policy terms, but also in practical terms as well. And that must continue as we continue this journey forward.
Thank you, Minister. I'd like now to take a look at the educational sector. As far as the censorship, the censor, and the research found that the representation of women in institutions of higher education sits at 38.9%. And Dade Mohale, you started speaking about this a little bit earlier on, and I'd like you to focus on perhaps why this is the case. You spoke about UCT being one of the forerunners as far as representation is concerned. What needs to be done in order to facilitate a higher and even greater number here?
Let me start first by supporting what Honorable Minister Pravin is saying about hollowing out of state institutions, because he's sitting with a classic victim of this state capture. Ms. Sizagele Mzimela was the CEO of SAA. She's now the CEO of Transnet Freight Rail. And her only sin at SAA is that she refused to sign the only profitable route between OR Tambo and Mumbai to the Gupta brothers. And because of that, she was fired. Woman on to become the first woman general manager at SAA. With Minister Alec Ewen, we loved the work that she was doing so much that we made her the CEO of South African Express Airways, flying at that time collectively to 700 destinations. And so good that we took her back to SAA as the CEO. And together with the 4 Africans that were killed by state capture at Eskom in just 6 months of their tenure, they ended up being absolutely jobless. Tammy, in the 26 public institutions of higher learning, here we have a forum of chancellors, and I'm on the steering committee, 5 of us, and we brought in probably 5 key principles, because I already said women are more enrolled in terms of numbers, they graduate more than men, and with better grades. So we said, I think number 1 that we needed to do was to see whether we can't have a much more social justice approach in the way that we look at institutions of higher learnings, where universities propel democratic engagement. 2, we said, is it possible that we can advocate for academic freedom that is contextual within our own environment, which nurtures success of the higher education system through assessment of different perspectives, not what we have done in the 48 years of apartheid. Thirdly, we said, can we conceptualize an ethical approach that will guide societal engagement and governance? And when we also said, can we also look at promoting public ownership of institutions of higher learning, where the public recognize their role as both beneficiaries and stakeholders in the accomplishments of these universities? And then lastly, of course, we said, can we advocate for the financial sustainability of these universities, for the development of long-term sustainable models of student funding? Because the majority of these students that are being enrolled today are women. I mean, I've got a wonderful example of a woman who came from Limpopo, 22 years later, goes to VET and sees a flushing toilet for the first time. So under these circumstances, how do we look at the graduation halls, the symbolism, the art, the culture, the ethos in these institutions, other than saying not only are they outrightly hostile to women, but how can we make sure that they feel needed and wanted, that they feel included, that they can make a contribution, be free to speak their mind without any fear of retributions or reprisals? Let me end by saying at Forte University, 98% of the students are on NSFAS, and 72% of them are women, where NSFAS not only has to pay for the tuition and accommodation, but also for the meals of these students, because if they go to classes hungry, they can't even concentrate. Metami.
You know, Ms. Kuba, as Ndate Mohale is speaking here, my thoughts go to you as well as Ms. Takuddin. Both of you are chartered accountants, at least come from a chartered accountant background, finance being key to your professions and to your progress in corporate South Africa. But when you look at deans of universities being women, specifically in the STEM sectors, that is very scarce. Only 8 out of 26 women in higher education institutions were specializing in the STEM subjects. What have been your experiences, if you could maybe rewind and take us back a little bit, Yolanda, as a woman in higher education? What does this say? Is it a reflection of the level of uptake in the STEM subjects from even an entry-level stage for young girls and young women?
Absolutely. I mean, Tammy, if I look back in time, right, even when I was at varsity, there were far less women actually going into these subjects, but that is changing. For us to actually change it, we actually have to look at this from an ecosystem perspective or holistically. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is on this whole issue around economic equality. And economic equality has more than 2 or 3 elements in my mind. The first one, and the most important one, is around the occupational segregation. You know, you've got vertical segregation and you've got occupational segregation, where men are in industries that generally actually pay better, right? And so women have no examples of excellence or examples of progress that they can actually look up to, that this is possible or this is not possible. And so we need more pioneering women. So I'm calling on women actually to say, let's go out there and actually go and pioneer new industries, new areas where there are few women in those areas, and actually make it work. And to be honest, I mean, in 2021, there are already women, just few, in a lot of those STEM areas. I mean, if we look at statistically in terms of where students are actually falling short, definitely in terms of enrollment, we're still actually seeing less women actually apply for those STEM subjects. And that's the first actually challenge, is the entry, because there's no motivation on the other side. When we wanted to be CAs, right, there were not a lot of CAs that were around you, but you knew that if you actually studied and became a CA, you had a better chance of success in terms of business and so on. And it was enough of a motivation to actually get you into that path. When I qualified, there were less than 100 women CAs, Black women CAs in South Africa. So, I mean, and today there are so many of us, not enough, but at least there are so many of us. Now we actually count in the thousands rather than in the hundreds. So for me, it's really putting in front of people examples of excellence and actually motivating, mentoring, sponsoring people to actually deliberately get into those spaces and those industries where women traditionally have not actually gotten into, so that we can actually see people rise up to the top in those specific areas.
Ms. Takurdeen, as a woman and at the time a younger woman in academia, specifically in the STEM sector, what was your experience and what did you find to be the barriers to entry and the barriers to excellence at the time?
Thanks, Tommy. I agree with what Yolanda has said. I do feel as though, I always say I've never wanted to, dreamed of becoming a chartered accountant. My upbringing, my horizons were limited to what my society had exposed me to. And growing up, all I really was exposed to was doctors, lawyers, teachers, and accountants, and that's it. I didn't understand that there was such a thing as head of risk at a bank, or there was such a thing as an economist. Had I been exposed to that, I think that would have changed my career path. And so I feel as though that structural problems that we've got in society limit the exposure and therefore the economic potential of both women and men in certain lesser privileged and lesser economically active environments in the country. So I think in order to break that insidious loop that that must be broken, we need more exposure across all parts of society to these sorts of careers. And people like Yolanda, people like Basi do incredibly important work in making sure that we mentor, expose people. I spend a lot of my time also doing that in particularly the poorer communities, in exposing them to where they can chart these courses of not the typical, as I said, limited horizon of exposure.
And Dr. Mohale, as we wrap up the section on women in higher education institutes, if we look here at the rate of increase, according to the report in the census, it says that 23.1% of women are in vice chancellor roles. And in 2016, this was at 15%. And although the numbers are relatively low, it is almost an 8% increase in 5 years, which is quite exponential. And it's quite dramatic in comparison to other sectors. What would you attribute this exponential jump and acceleration in women in vice chancellor and chancellor roles?
So first, I think, let me thank the chancellors themselves, but also the chairs of council who go out looking for capable women. Two, I think even more important, Sister Tammy, is the fact that when we consider the percentage of people that go to institutions of higher learning during apartheid was 7%. Now that we've been free for 27 years, we've only increased that to 11%. A bigger component of the conversation has to be to say, but why did we close the other avenue?
Dr. Mohale, unfortunately, we are losing your connection there. It's quite compromised. So I am going to, to move on to our next question. And Dr. Mohale, we are losing you there. The connection is not the best. But let's move now to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and the numbers and the figures that we are seeing there. Ms. Takurdeen, according to the census, there was an increase from 9 to 25 women chairpersons from 2004 in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange listed entities. Did you, as the JSE, have anything to do with that? Do you influence, leadership decisions and chairpersonships in listed companies at all?
Yeah, Tommy, thanks for that. We can't really, as the setter of the listing requirements and the regulator, we can't tell companies who to appoint to boards, but we can certainly influence their representation. And how we did that was we were pushed quite strongly by organizations like BWASA, amongst others, who really made meaningful contribution to these listing requirements a few years ago. They pushed us to be braver and more courageous, which is exactly to the point of what is needed is courageous leadership in influencing these diversity policies. So we set them to say, If you're a listed company, you need to disclose your diversity policy. And then it's up to what we call the guardians of governance, various stakeholders, to hold these companies accountable to say, okay, so this is your diversity policy. Firstly, to criticize it, is it good enough? And then secondly, to hold them accountable to how far are you on this track or targets that you've set yourself, and to ask about the targets. And that doesn't mean it's promoting shareholder activism. No, it means shareholders holding the organizations accountable, but as well as the those that are internal to the organizations, like employees and the board itself. And then there's a whole extension, like analyst communities, potential investors, and that need to play their part in this interrogation. And we believe that is something that has shifted the dials. Not enough, but certainly the results of this research I found were quite encouraging.
And Yolanda, you going back now to CEOs in Johannesburg Stock Exchange listed companies, you enjoy the title of being one of the youngest CEOs of Johannesburg listed company when you were only 29. How has that scenario changed thus far? And what would you say have been the factors that have influenced that?
It has changed slowly. It has changed very, very slowly. I mean, when we look at the numbers that have been presented in the census, it's nowhere near enough. When we actually have like sub 25%, when we have 50% of the population, we can't be satisfied. And for me, that's really the context. And we can blame apartheid first, but now we actually had democracy since 1994. So we can't say now that the issue is training. A person who qualified in 1994 actually today could have been a CEO. So this is not a training issue anymore. So it's not a timing issue anymore. It actually is a thing around commitment. And I've seen some companies make commitment to the transformation of their boards. And we actually should commend them and continue to celebrate those companies that have made those commitments. And the other day I was talking to another forum, and I said, when commitment actually happens and the board itself, the entire board, commits itself to transformation, we actually see it in 2 or 3 years. We don't actually have to wait 10 years. And I'll pick on MTN, for example. About 18 months ago, there was only one woman on the exco. And as we speak now, there are 4 women on the exco of MTN. And that is within a period of 18 months. So it is possible to continue that transformation. And MTN has committed itself to a 50-50 representation across all the levels in terms of the business. So from that perspective, are we having enough people actually committing themselves? What are the barriers towards this? As I said earlier, there is something around this sort of occupational segregation where men actually tend to actually occupy roles or into sectors or industries which a lot of women still actually are limited in terms of going into. That is still a problem that we need to address. And that is a systematic commitment and sponsorship, as I said. And on the other side, around the issue of vertical segregation really has to do with the decision that you can make tomorrow as a board. So from that perspective, it makes absolutely no sense why women are paid differently to men, why for the same level of work, we're still having different kind of conversations. When we talk about women, we're saying that let's take a risk on her. But when we talk about men with same qualifications, similar years, then we say, no, let's give this opportunity to Mr. Y. That even selection of language, that actually has to do with how we actually view women in our own societies, in business, is actually the very thing that keeps on pushing women down the ladder. We're not taking risk on women. We're giving them the same opportunities at equal pay, at equal qualification as men. And we should actually be driving that very, very hard as society. So those are the things that I would say. I mean, there are definitely, there's a little progress that we are definitely not satisfied with.
Ms. Takudeen, looking at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange itself, would you say that there is a culture of grooming women into positions of CEOs. There has been Dr. Fourie, there was Ms. Nikki Newton-King, and she has basically, or she was in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange for a good 2 decades plus, and then worked her way up to the level of group CEO. Is that a deliberate decision and part of the culture of grooming within the Johannesburg Stock Exchange?
It's definitely a deliberate decision, and it is leading by example and walking the talk. So you talk about mentoring the women in the organization. To start with, you need a good enough representation within the employee base. We have 53% female across the entire organization. So we have plenty candidates for that. A few years ago, we decided that we would set the target and we would hold ourselves accountable no matter what. And I wish it was as complicated as financial services jargon, but just as financial services jargon, there's no rocket science to it. We literally just use common tools that are available to all corporates in order to implement these targets. So tools such as policies, processes, practices, and obviously corporate values, which everyone's got, right? So we make use of these very, very simple tools, and that's no different from any other organization. But the difference, I believe, is actually in the leadership imperative. So having the courage to be able to push through these sometimes very uncomfortable and difficult conversations in the boardroom, which I've been privileged enough to lead or to be witness to. And so leading by example is very important. We would be criticized if we were setting listing requirements and not practicing what we've preached. But more recently, Tammy, we actually criticized for having too many women. A high-class problem.
Yeah, well, being criticized for having too many women at a time when, you know, women are still very much underrepresented, perhaps talks to what Minister Pravin Gordhan was speaking to earlier on, the change of mindset that perhaps still needs to be there, the patriarchy that is still so endemic within South African culture and South African norms. But Yolanda, you have worked your way up in various companies, whether it was with Vodacom or whether it's with MTN now, having held senior positions not only in South Africa, but also on the rest of the continent. What would you say have been some of the key elements that have led to your growth and your escalation within the corporate sector? And also, if you could talk about the initiative that you founded, the Mentorship Boardroom, and what brought that about? What gaps did you see that made you think, you know what, something needs to be done?
I mean, let's first pick up on the how did I get it? Firstly, the one thing that I did, I mean, before becoming the CEO that you mentioned at the age of 29, a lot of people don't actually, not at least that are not aware of, is that I was a deputy CEO for 3 years before becoming the CEO. So it wasn't an elevation. It was actually a literal kind of training ground and a deliberate action that actually happened there. And it was really a consequence of good planning and being deliberate, as said before. So for me, I mean, that's important in terms of that. However, as an individual, you actually have to make a conscious decision to say, I actually want A, B, and C for myself. You know, no one can actually make you want to be a CEO or a group CFO or whatever of any company, except if you want it for yourself. So from that perspective, I mean, I've had many mentors, many sponsors along the way that have helped me actually carve out the kind of career that I've had. And I mean, I'm eternally curious, right? And I've got people like Abu Bonang and so on that you can tap into at any time for learning, stretching you in different ways, and the conversations with them that actually make you actually want to be better, not just for yourself, but for society at large. And that's really what then moved me into, prompting me into this area of saying, how can I do this for others? How can I actually make sure that people actually have access to people like Basetsana, people like you, Tammy, people like Bona, people like the CEO a lot of people don't. And that I saw made a big difference in my own personal career. And I started the mentorship boardroom in order to solve that problem for younger people that just have no access to these trailblazers, and also at the same time make it easier for trailblazers to give up their time, right? Because remember, I mean, if we don't have a platform that is easy for engagement for people, it's not like a lot of us are sitting at home and saying, we don't want to give back, we don't want to help. However, the platforms that make it easier for us to be able to do that are just not present. And basically, I started the Mentorship Boardroom as an online platform that actually helps mentors register themselves when they are available. And that's important, when they are available for others to actually be able to select them as mentors, and they can actually choose to do just a once-off session or a continuous session on the platform. On the other side, it actually then invited mentees, young people. In fact, I mean, when I say young people, it actually is a little bit of a misnomer, because we have people who are 56 years old who are also mentees, because some of them want to change careers, they want to change industries, and they have a requirement to be mentored by someone else in a different industry, for example. So we have all these mentees that now can actually look through the platform and say, I want to be mentored by Mr. X. And now they all of a sudden have access to Mr. X. So long as obviously Mr. X or Ms. Y actually takes and says, I'm agreeing to actually have this conversation with you. So that's what the platform is about. And it really was necessitated by me actually saying, I benefit in a material way through mentorship, sponsorship, and people supporting me along the way. This journey has not been mine alone. I mean, let's start with the way it starts. It starts with the ANC and the right policies around BEE, right? Without those policies, guys, I wouldn't have made it to step one or step two of my career. And to actually see myself where I am today, you know, the policies of the ANC are still super supportive to where I have actually come to. And then secondly, it's the mentors, the sponsors. And thirdly, it's my own drive, curiosity, competence, and consistency and courage that actually helps you actually get there ultimately.
Ms. Takordeen, Yolanda spoke there about the increase in the number of women chartered accountants in the country. The census has found that to be sitting at 39% of chartered accountants in South Africa being women. With these numbers and with the rise of numbers of chartered accountants, is this likely to filter through in the number of executives that we may end up having, the number of CEOs, the number of CFOs, as a direct result of this? What have you found?
Tammy, I think there's going to be a lag. So these are fresh numbers, right? And to Yolanda's point about experience, someone would have had to qualify earlier on in order to get to the C-suite. And that's something that we need to be careful of. We don't want to put newly qualifieds in roles where they're not prepared or have the appropriate experience, especially at the C-suite level, and then fail and then get criticized for it. Because that is also driving a very, very negative, again, insidious narrative, which we don't want. So to the extent that there's 39% representation today, that should filter through over the coming years. And we're definitely seeing a fast tracking of female CAs, and in particular of color, moving through the ranks faster than others, and at least I'm seeing that. And whilst I encourage that, we need to just be sure that we don't set these women up for failure. So I do think there's a careful balance we need to, as leaders, manage.
And Dr. Mohale, you spoke earlier on about the proverbial glass ceiling that has now become a concrete ceiling. If we look at the numbers based on the census, there is a low representation of women in multinationals. It's currently sitting at 38%. Talk to us about this concrete ceiling. How does it move from glass to concrete?
So, Sister Tammy, I kicked my iPad. Like I said, the connectivity here, I'm hoping you can hear me now.
Yes, we can, Baba.
So I've been very humbled beyond words that Usisi Yolanda Tuba made me part of these mentors in her truly world-class program. And I've got a young man that I've now met with 3 times, and I can assure you, I learned more from this youngster than this youngster could possibly learn from me. Let me pick up on what Artie said. You see, this are disingenuous as business people. When we put women in positions of leadership, especially as CEOs, there's an expectation that 100% of them should succeed. And yet, not 100% of men succeed. Therefore, we should be comfortable to take a chance on women and allow them to fail the same way that men fail all the time. Especially because life teaches us that you learn more from those things that you don't get right the first time than from those that you do. So this double standard, when it's women we are considering, they say, let's show us demonstrable and demonstrable track record. You can't learn to swim by reading a book. At some stage, you have to put your big toe into the water. And that's what we as companies can do. We should take a risk. We should counsel, coach, and hold by the hand so that people eventually become truly exceptional CEOs like Yolandi. The reason why we are in a spot of bother now, I think a large part of it is because we are not affirming women. We are keeping the other half outside of this economic war, because the definition of strategy is simply how to compete. And we compete at the country, at the business, at the personal level. Taiwan posted a 2.98 positive GDP growth during the pandemic when we contracted by -7%. And part of the reason it's because when you look at the Q2 stats figures from Stats SA, it still says woefully inadequate because we grew 1.2% positive GDP growth, but the population growth is 1.6%. But even if you did a small arithmetic, crude as it is, you say if interest rate is 6%, CPI is 3%, it stands to reason that the economy must grow at GDP growth I'm talking about. Otherwise, you're going better. Not in those sectors that absorb women in large numbers, like tourism and hospitality, where 70% of the 1.5 million workforce, it's actually women. But also, we're not even taking advantage of the commodity super cycle, like we missed it during coal when China was demanding. And part of it is because even the value chain
Dr. Mohale, we'll have to leave it at that for now. Dr. Mohale, your connection is compromising and we're not really hearing you. Dr. Mohale, I apologize. I'll have to ask you to leave it at that just for now.
We absorb more women. Like,
I don't think he's actually even able to hear me at this point. But let us move ahead nonetheless. I'd like to ask you this, Ms. Taushuddin. Professional companies, according to the census, are sitting at 36.7% women representation. What are the stumbling blocks, and what have been the stumbling blocks in your career as a professional woman?
You know, it just bottoms down to leadership. It's as simple as that. If the numbers are saying that there's not enough women representation, then the fact is that there's not enough leaders that are open enough to encourage a more inclusive environment. It's as simple as that. But we don't need to make a business case, right? That more women representation will mean success. At the end of the day, the purpose of business is no longer for profit as it was decades ago. The purpose for business is to improve the society in which the business operates. And through being more inclusive, you would naturally be more successful, but also you would improve the society in which you operate. And that's the bottom line, is there's a severe lack of leadership in the right direction with the right mindset, and that courageous leadership is urgently required.
Yolanda, you have spoken about the benefit of the mentorship that you've had, but I want to ask you a different question here between Black women and white women. Is there a competition for those much coveted women's seats and women, seats at the boardroom table, or is any woman good enough?
I would say, I mean, I'm just thinking about my experience who I've competed with on roles in the past. I've actually competed more with white men than I have with white women, strange enough. And I guess it is an issue around that we both are women actually struggling in the same fight more than it is anything else. So yeah, I mean, I would say it's been an issue around how many people are in the room, and there just seems to be less of women overall in the room, and therefore you're just competing mostly, especially at a listed level, with white men.
And I'd like to bring this back to you, Bonang, just your comments on that, from that perspective, because no longer is it a gender issue, but it really is about it. Well, it still remains a gender issue, even within race. Just your comments regarding that. I think we may have lost Bonang there. Perhaps Ms. Takurjean, your experience?
Tami, I think, yeah, similar to Yolanda, I think it's more a male-female matter than it is within the female. There's a race issue. So as the first levels, representation is important and is a great move forward in progression terms. Then the second lens is, what does that gender look like? And there's certainly a concentration of white board members, as you could see in those examples that came out in these consensus. And I think that I'm not sure whether boards deliberately do this. I think the boards need to focus on a healthy mix. But some boards, for example, just having females on board is good enough as their diversity progress. And whilst we'll take it, we do need to look at a racial lens across the entire composite in any event. And that is, getting into, again, a high-class problem if we look at now analyzing the composite within a race of a gender. So I think first steps first is certainly get the gender right, and then if there's a fair enough distribution across race, that's good as well. But I think you can't have them exclusive, mutually exclusive. You've got to actually look at both lenses every single time as you chart forward on your diversity policies. That's the way we look at it, at least.
Minister Gordon, let me bring you in here. I think that is quite an interesting discussion to be having. Is it about women, whether they are Black or white, and is race a factor? But from the two women that we have on the panel here, clearly it still really is very much about race and not so much about gender when it comes to competition. What have been your observations in government and state-owned enterprises?
Well, we live in South Africa. So South Africa has a long history of racism, of oppression, of exploitation, and of marginalization. And we have our own unique set of dynamics that we have to actually deal with, which involve race, class, and gender. And it's a combination of the three that, as we seek to transform the economy and transform key institutions, be they public or private, those three factors are going to, if you like, entangle with each other in order to find the right answer. And the right answer lies in ensuring that we cure marginalization on the one hand, inequality on the other hand, and that ultimately we have a demographically representative private sector and public sector as well. So I think in different contexts, you're going to have, if you like, using your words, the competition is going to be either on a gender basis or on a race basis. It could even be nowadays the generation basis, because many of the younger people are saying, you old guys, get out of the way. And younger people need to move into position. That's where Arthi's earlier proposition is an important one, that both opportunity but also experience are an important mix that we've got to get right. And Bonang is also right, that there are times when you, inverted commas, give an opportunity rather than take a chance for people who are normally outside of the paradigm actually get a role. Each institution will as we go forward, because that is South Africa. And it's still going to take us decades before we can actually overcome some of these particular issues as well. But I think we're making progress in the right direction. And the more we have facts and studies by organizations like yours coming to the fore, because the facts must speak for themselves, the better are the opportunities for us to have debates of this sort. But more importantly, I think we need to direct these debates towards finding solutions that can actually work at the end of the day, and which are going to propel people to think differently, as I've said before, but also do things differently. And as some of you have said, walk the talk rather than just do the talking. So those are factors that I think we need to bring to bear into these debates. But if I can just add one last word, if you don't mind, and that is that whilst we're looking at the business sector, the real South Africa goes way beyond the business sector. And so the leaders that you represent as the Women's Association is going to have to apply itself to precisely some of the debates that we've had this morning. How do you change culture and values in institutions and create organizations that have the right kind of outlook consistent with the kind of vision we have 40 for some of the younger people amongst us. Secondly, what does inclusivity actually mean, as I pointed out earlier on? And over and above the gender or race issues, I think whether you're a male or a female, working in the national interest and balancing that with the personal interest, factor, because our economic system often gets us to become highly individualistic. And that individuality, not individualistic behavior, must be balanced against the kind of society that we have, and how the collective talents that you represent can be used to improve the life and living standards of all of our people. And that's where the issue of social justice comes into the equation as well. So what we require are leaders, particularly men who can change their mindsets, and women who can set a different kind of, I think one of you used the words, pioneering approaches to change in South Africa, where social equity between men and women becomes important, where growing our economy in an inclusive way becomes important, where attracting investment into our economy, both from the private sector here, which reputedly Bonang has R1 trillion stashed away somewhere, and that money can make a huge difference if we actually have confidence in our economy, and then become passionate about social justice. There are too many women who still live in an economically and socially oppressed environment in South Africa. And part of the ambition that all of us should have is, how do we cure that position for the majority of women in this country? Thank you very much.
So true, Minister. You've literally echoed and uttered what our approach really to development for our country should be, an approach of Ubuntu, which is inclusive and that does not segment and gives people an equal opportunity to be able to strive and to be the best that they can be. You spoke as well, Minister, about finding solutions. And at this point, I am going to open up the lines for any questions that you have. You can tweet your questions, you can Facebook them, you can put them right here on Zoom, wherever platform it is that you're using to watch this, you can certainly post them there. And I'd like to bring you in as well, Basi and Kunyalala, as we focus on some of the questions that we've already received, because the first one that I'd like to read is actually directed to you, Basi. It's from Pateka, who says, Basi, listening to all these issues like gaps in empowering women, as women who have journeyed through these challenges, what interventions can we deploy and how would you get support to bridge this gap? Basi, if you could just jump in here as well and give your comments as to women who have journeyed through challenges of empowerment and inclusion, what interventions can be deployed by women who would like to get support to bridge this gap? Basi, would you like to come in here?
Yes, thank you, Tammy. I think that question is very critical in many ways, in that the BWA Census, for example, is a critical tool that we can use to be able to bridge that gap and deploy it as data that is accountable, the research that has spoken to the disparities of the haves and have-nots, and how women over the decades have been marginalized economically. And if we can be able to, because if you cannot track it, you cannot measure it. So the census gives us that particular tool to be able to track it, so we can measure it, that over time we can see the trajectory of women's participation in the mainstream of the economy really grow. And I think critically also mentoring is a very important part of women, and that's why the organization that Yolanda has founded, the Mentoring Board, is very critical, because many of us are true products of being mentored by women who saw it important to pay it forward, women who kept the ladder up so that some of us could climb, but more so when you get to the top floor, not to forget to send down the elevator, so that there is more of us in the boardroom, more of us taking up space around the boardroom table, and also critically to continue to leave the door open, such that more of us and more of our voices could be in those environments. So there's a long way for us to go, and I think through the BWA Census, and it's at a very snail pace, because if you see the census report from 2004 to date, really much still needs to be done in terms of just upskilling and fast tracking the upward mobility of women in South Africa.
Thank you, Basi, for that answer. Any of our panelists who want to contribute to any of the questions that have been asked, you can just raise your hand within the platform, and I will give you an opportunity then to be able to have your say. But failing which, now there is a comment that comes through from Trudia Prekel, who says, interesting discussion. I only got the invitation yesterday, but she says, there's great progress that has been made since 1977 when I first researched it, but many of the problems identified then and in the 80s are still with us. It may be interesting to look back 45 years. And Dade Mohale, I'd like to give this one to you. Looking back over the past 45 years, Ms. Prekel says a lot of the challenges that we experience now were challenges that were experienced back then too. And I think Minister Gordhan touched on this a little bit earlier on when you spoke about, you know what we are in South Africa. This is the legacy of our past. Dade Mohale.
Sister Tammy, thank you very much. Again, let me apologize. I've never been so traumatized by Wi-Fi like I've been today. So it is true that in the 45 and 50 years, the progress has been minuscule. And we should be dissatisfied with the progress that we are making, because at this rate, actually, it will take 150 years for this society to be broadly reflective of the demographics. On your earlier question about women, white and or black, you know, equality is not justice. There is nothing more unequal as treating two unequal people equally. Therefore, here we see a classical case of the intersectionality of race, gender, class, but now also generation. So instead of African women, Black women in general, thinking that they're competing with white women, gender equality, pay parity is too important and national agenda. Explicit about what are those things that we are going to cooperate and collaborate on. Thank you, Sister.
Thank you so much, Ntate Mohale. My heart just bleeds for you. And Yolanda, at this point, I mean, you would be our saving grace as the queen that you are. We need you to come to the rescue here for Ntate Mohale. There's a comment. Kunyala, I see your hand is up. Please have the floor.
I think that the point I was going to raise was I think this is something that the minister touched on a bit earlier. Our mind in terms of because where we find ourselves in the systems that we have, in the systems and processes that we have created that ensure that women remain where they are a function of are a function of what we think is a function of how we are wired. So I was talking at a platform a couple of weeks ago, and I think the question that was asked was what is the next frontier in terms of us fighting the issues around inequality. And I think for me the most critical thing is our own mental handicap. So what is holding us back in order for us to make the decisions that are necessary to see the change that we want to see? So until such time that we have freed our mind in terms of understanding that understanding and knowing the fact that women, like their male counterparts, have got the capacity, they do, but it's no longer an issue of objectively making a decision whether to appoint or not to appoint, but it's a function of mentally have we accepted the fact that that is the case. And until we get to that point where we can deliberately see it in our minds, we probably are going to be 100 years later. Somebody asked the question about this was the case 45 years ago and is still the case now, and it will continue until we get to a point where we are also able to come to some sort of mental reconfiguration and say, you know what, we men and women have got the capacity to do the same type of work. So that's the comment that I wanted to make. Thank you. Back to you, Tammy.
Thank you so much, Kunya, for that. The final question, which is as well, comes from this morning. Feroz writes, the census report will serve as a catalyst for discussion and action around women in leadership. The role of all CEOs and women have reached the top is critical in creating an enabling environment for more women to move through the ranks. She then goes on to say, we all to take care of the women are not set after being selected to lead through a crisis. I'm going to pose this one to you, Minister Gordhan, and get your thoughts regarding this. Women in positions of leadership during a time of crisis, and this potentially being a potential setup for failure for them, according to Ms. Feroz Oten. What are your views on that, and have you seen this play out practically?
Not really. I think any person, particularly in this instance a woman, who appears to be very quiet, very recessive, but put a crisis in front of that person. And if the right ingredients are there within the makeup of the individual, you can see remarkable leaders emerging in crises. I've seen that over many decades now. So I don't think there's a straight line between women in crisis equals failure. I think you can have men who can fail miserably as well in these situations. And often you will find that the least expected person in a crisis can become a shining star in solving the problems before us. So it depends on the circumstance, it depends on the individual, it depends on whether a spark is created in that individual who suddenly begins to see things that that person didn't have the opportunity to see before and wasn't exposed to these sorts of situations before. So any person, and in this particular instance, any woman can succeed remarkably, but equally, men and women can have setbacks because they're not up to the task that is actually ahead of us. But I'm a person, as an activist, I've grown up to have trust in people and so-called ordinary people. And they will surprise us from time to every single time with wisdom, with insights, and with boldness that we don't expect. So you don't need a title to become a leader in a crisis situation. If you have the right chemistry at that particular point in time, remarkable things can happen. So let's give everybody a chance.
Ultimately, I guess, Minister, leadership does emerge, and specifically during times of crisis, because those are the do or die moments. As we wrap up our session for this morning, I'd just like to recap on some of the summaries from the business women in, or rather women in leadership census for 2021. At the top of representativity and gender equity was the national government departments at 43.5%. State-owned enterprises followed at 40.4%, public higher education institutions at 38.9%, multinational organizations follow with 38%, professional entities 36.7%, and at the bottom of the barrel, JSE listed. That then is the summary. Artie, I wonder why. And a bit of a tongue as well. Well, that's how we're going to come to the end of it. But before we do, perhaps just some final thoughts as we wrap up the discussions that we've had today, the points that have been brought up, and putting those points into perspective with the numbers and perhaps charting a way forward. And as the minister said, finding solutions. Let's start with you, Ms. Yolanda.
Thanks, Tammy. I guess I'll start off where we actually, I'll end off where we started. And my first comment was that we can't be a nation that celebrates excellence and greatness if we actually continue to systematically and deliberately exclude women. And everything that we actually have discussed today has actually given us evidence that we are still systematically actually excluding women. While there is progress is nowhere near enough for us to actually be satisfied. So let's continue being part of where we are, and let's also not pay lip service to the progress that we need to actually achieve. Where we need to actually get to is at least 50-50, and we should not compromise on the 50-50 representation across the board. And that does require courageous leadership, and that is the common theme that has been coming through today.
Thank you very much. Ntate Mohale.
A nation that hates its own enlightened is doomed to fail. Isn't it amazing that the strongest amongst us are those that are making time to help others, even they themselves are still struggling with their own challenges? Success is a system. Therefore, we should set women up for success. Because if you are a good cardiothoracic surgeon at Sherlock Maxeke Hospital, when you are banished to Brantford, at the best, you are a good GP that can only dispense a Panado, because the system, it's not there. It can't hold you up. It can't support you. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you so much, Ntate Mohale. Ms. Artie.
Tammy, I think the consensus is a call on the private sector leadership to do better, because we certainly pride ourselves on being at the top of the ranks in technology and all sorts of policy advancement. So to be at the bottom of the barrel is really not acceptable. I think it does take a change in mindset, and certainly courageous leadership that's so necessary.
Thank you very much. Minister Gordhan, final word with you.
No, thank you very much. I think we need to liberate the collective energy of women in our society, which will make a huge impact on the economy, the size of the economy, the inclusivity in our economy, and we should all combine our individual talents and resources so that the bottom of the pyramid in our society doesn't reflect what it reflects today: inequality, poverty, marginalization. So we have I think we've done remarkably well up to this point in time, but let's look at the next 10 years and what is it that the younger amongst us and those who survive this particular period, to what difference can they make so that in a shorter period of time we can lift more people up out of poverty and inequality and become real players in our economy, which has a huge potential if women become key participants in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Gordhan. Thank you to our esteemed panelists, Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister Pravin Gordhan, Ndade Bonang Mohale, Chancellor at the University of the Free State and Chair of BWASA. Thank you very much, Ms. Yolanda Kuba, the VP for Southern and East Africa at MTN and also founder of the Mentorship Boardroom, and Ms. Arti Tarkudin, CFO of JSE. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight and your expertise this morning. And thank you too, as well, the Business Women's Association of South Africa. Indeed, you cannot improve on and you cannot grow what you do not and cannot measure. So the importance of statistics and the importance of doing this groundwork is really the foundation and the springboard that South Africa needs for total transformation. Minister Gordhan, as you said, the transformation in the leadership is not only to be found and reflected in areas of business, but indeed throughout every strata of South African society. From myself, Tami Ngubeni, as well as all of the panelists here with us this morning, I bid you farewell, but handing the reins over to the chairperson of the Business Women's Association of South Africa, Ms. BWASA Census, as well as the president of the association, Ms. Kunyalala Mapisa. Thank you very much. Over to you, ladies, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you very, very much, Tami, for being our moderator this morning. Much, much appreciated as you really just helped us to get into the meat of what the census is about. Just from my side as the chair of the organization, we would like to implore every single South African, government, private sector, SOEs, to really take to heart this report, this census for 2021, that when we do census next year, the numbers have begun to change dramatically. This is not a census book that just should be put in shelves. This is the one that will really help us to track and move the economic agenda of women forward, to move the gender parity conversation forward, to make sure that women, as we rebuild our economy post-COVID, women are indeed at the forefront. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I'll just hand over now to my president, Kunya.
Yeah, I think I also just want to echo my colleague Basi in terms of just thanking, first of all, Tami, for all your hard work in terms of moderating this conversation, and also just once again to thank our esteemed panelists for making it throughout and really being engaged. I think that this is a conversation, this is just but the beginning, because what we believe is that a report such as the census doesn't end at the point when we launch. It's actually just the beginning of a conversation that we need to continue having and saying, if these numbers are going to change, what is the kind of work that we need in our individual spaces. And I think that it would also be remiss of me not to our possible, and that was Anglo-American. And we have our colleague from Anglo-American, Navashni, who is on standby. I think that, as you know, Anglo-American, Ms. Nolita Fakude is the executive chair. This is work that she also she has been supportive in this report comes to life, and you never would have been able to do this without them. So Navashni, I just want to say to you and your team and perhaps a word from you, because I know that you've been with us the whole morning, and thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, President, and also to the panel for the robust conversation that we've been having, and I think just really highlighting just how in our society. And I join you today as a woman in an industry whose historic exclusion of women is well documented. In fact, it's an industry in which women were not even legally permitted to work underground just 25 years ago. And the legal battle, of course, was arguably the easy part of our journey for greater participation and inclusion, which is why I feel really privileged to speak Anglo-American today. Certainly been bold and ambitious in trying to address the occupational segregation that Yolanda spoke about, and the greater participation and inclusion of women at all levels within the company, and for the transformation of the mining sector and indeed the labour market as a whole, in embracing the critical role that women play in the success of companies, of the economy and society. Listening to the discussion today, I can't help but feel exceedingly proud that we announced the appointment of yet another powerful woman, Mpumi Zikalala, who is currently the managing director of our De Beers business and who will lead Kumba Iron Ore from January. She will lead Kumba alongside Natasha Pullion, who is the CEO of another listed company that belongs to Anglo-American, and that's Anglo-American Platinum. And you've recognized Nolita Fakude. She is the chair of the management board in South Africa. She is also the president Minerals Council in South Africa. These are serious female corporate heavyweights, and they are leading Anglo-American strategic assets in South Africa. Yet, as a company, we are under no illusion that the path for us as a company and as a society is a long one. Women everywhere struggle for equal rights, dignity, economic liberation, and freedom from violence. And reflecting on the work that you are doing as the BWASA, you are providing actionable data and insights on why we need to prioritize this important cause and our opportunity to build back better as we regain our foothold and recover from the COVID-19 crisis. And so therefore, we are extremely pleased to have partnered with the BWASA on its 2021 census. For over 40 years, you have done phenomenal work in advocating for the rights and advance of women, showing not only the wonderful balance in diversity of thought, objectivity, and decision-making that women bring into the boardroom, but I think also, the long journey that still lies ahead of us, and the slow and incremental progress that we've been making over the years. Gender equality really does remain a problem for all of us. And I think recognizing it as we've done this morning is really the most important starting point. The industry that I work in is certainly on its own journey. And some of the things that we're very passionate about doing is to openly share the lessons that we've learned and that we are learning on our journey with each other and with society more broadly, so that we can learn through each other rather than alone, and maybe close that gap, make it a little bit faster. So at Anglo-American, we are making good progress in ensuring that women are given their rightful place in leading the company. It's not 50-50 yet, but certainly we've had a goal of 33% female representation by 2023 at all management levels. In 2016, we started at 15% of our workforce, being management. And at the end of last year, 2020, women accounted for about 27% of our leaders across the business. But gender equality is not just measured by having women in senior positions. It also means that every woman can bring her full self into an environment where she feels valued and her contribution to the organization as a whole is acknowledged. To Minister Gordon's points, we recognize that we need to take much bolder steps as organizations, but also as society, to create far more respectful and inclusive cultures so women can feel safe and supported at work. On that note, just 2 years ago, we launched our Living with Dignity program, which is a wide-ranging initiative that aims to support or confront, rather, gender-based violence in our host communities and our operations in South Africa. This program is designed to create a safe space for all people at work, at home, at school, and in the community, so they can live their lives with dignity. And our intention is to empower all of our colleagues with the right support, information, and guidance. So whether it's bullying or harassment, victimization, or GBV-related situations they might experience, that the support is provided in a nurturing way, but also in a neutral way. We also, as part of the mining sector, I think it's important to just talk about, the role and the changes in the mining sector. And as a company, we're part of the Leadership Forum that has committed to 7 principles of supporting women in mining, which includes ensuring that the workplace is geared for women, from how we go about designing personal protective equipment to rethinking the spaces in which women are expected to work. Undoubtedly, the liberation of women is tied to the liberation of society, and we acknowledge that the corporate sector plays a critical role in this liberation. It's like you said, Minister Gordon, we must all adopt a progressive mindset and champion a culture that embraces the inherent value that women bring. And, I, for one, I've never met a woman who started her career with less ambition than Amanda did. So I want to thank you to the BWASA for the role that you play in shining the spotlight on these critical issues so that we may all continue to introspect, to strategize, embrace and action the necessary plans for the empowerment of women so that we can all fully participate in the economy, within our companies and within society. So on behalf of Anglo American, your partner, thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, everyone. As Ndate Mbonang always says, please keep safe. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, South Africa, for being part of this auspicious occasion, the BWA South Africa Women in Leadership Census 2021. Thank you so much.
Thank you.